Hello, Art History. This is Mr. Smith, and today we're going to be starting our introduction into ancient Greece. Very exciting for me because this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. Um, and There's a lot to talk about, so I think I'm just going to jump into them now. So, when we talk about ancient Greece, obviously there's all of these islands out here in the Aegean Sea. Um, their proximity here to Turkey, lots of colonies settled in Turkey, including Troy, which was around 1200 BCE. You guys are probably familiar with this, the sack of Troy and things like that. A lot of these were Greek colonies. So Troy, not actually a foreign country, but actually a Greek colony settled by the Greeks on the coast of Turkey. So, the Greeks were sailors and they utilized a lot of these places. You guys may also be familiar with the island of Crete, and maybe the labyrinth of Crete, which was actually a palace dating back to around the same time as Troy, somewhere around 1200, by the Mycenaeans. And so there were lots of societies that existed in Greece before the ancient Greeks that we're talking about. There were groups like the Mycenaeans, which date back um, to somewhere around 1200 BCE, and they occupied a lot of the similar spots. So, like the Mycenaean period was named after the city of Mycenae, who was governed by a powerful warlord. But the period that we're talking about here really starts around 700, 600 BCE, and it goes from about 700, 600 BCE until the Romans come in and conquer a lot of this. So our unit will sort of also include Alexander the Great going down through Turkey into the Middle East and eventually down into Africa and then over to Persia as well. Um, but as we talk about ancient Greece, I feel like there's a couple things that we need to make really clear. Number one, Greece was never a united place. When we talk about Egypt, the first thing we talk about is uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. Greece was really never united. They would have to be conquered by Alexander the Great and his father Philip II in order to sort of put them all together. But they did have similar polytheistic religions. They had the same gods and goddesses. They did have similar culture, but I think the best way to think about the Greeks is actually to think of them as being fiercely independent and actually having sort of unique systems of government. So, for example, Sparta, you guys are probably familiar with. Sparta had this unique system where they had two kings, right? And then they had other sort of elected people. But they also had a very sort of like their government was strongly male dominated. They held slaves. They utilized the slaves to farm the area around them and didn't actually do any farming themselves. Versus the Athenians, who developed, as you probably well know, one of the first democratic systems of government. Now, the first direct democracy, even though it was only males that could vote, right? And foundationally, those things are really important, not only for history, but also for our course, because the vast majority of what we actually talk about today is going to be from Athens. And there's something about the democratic state that allowed for freedoms, not only in terms of rights and opportunities, but those sort of directly lead us into art and artistic license and freedom. If we were to compare, and we're not going to, but if we were going to compare the period of Athenian, sort of the golden age of Athenian um, democracy, and look at the art that was coming out of there, and compare that to like what was going on in Sparta, you wouldn't even find art in Sparta. They were too busy training to be warriors. They weren't, a craftsman and things like that. There were similar things that you could see in places like Corinth, where art was also important. But you'll notice that Corinth has quite the proximity to Athens, and Athens had a great deal of cultural influence on people and groups around them. And eventually, those cultural influences will sort of spread out beyond. The main period that we're going to talk about are the Archaic period, which, for your purposes, anything that's archaic, and there's a couple pieces that are archaic that we're going to study around 600 to 500 BCE. I like to use 480 BC because 480 is really probably the single most important date in what we're going to study today. And the reason why it's such an important date is because it's the end of the Persian Wars. So let me get to a marker here. So yeah, they've got the Persian Wars right here, is around 480 BCE. And that's really important because you had, during the Persian Wars, you had the foundation of something called the Delian League, which was the first time that the Greeks were united in some way, shape, or form. Now, the Delian League was a loose unity of the city-states, and the term polis is the term that they used. Polis means city-state, because it was a city, but they governed a fair amount of territory, and the cities had these sort of like hinterlands that were farms and things like that that were beyond. So and when you look at this map, it's sort of it sort of looks like they were states, right? In the American sense, but they weren't even remotely close to the states in the American sense. In fact, every single one of these was its own sovereign individual government. And that's actually one of the interesting things about the Delian League. It's one of the first times in Greek history that these Greeks actually unified, apart from, if you believe the stories of the Trojan Wars around 1200, the Greeks coming together to, fight a war in Troy. So the Delian League is important in that it sort of brought unity amongst the Greeks. That unity was led by the Spartans and it was led by the Athenians. And that's going to be particularly important for us understanding this period of the classical age, because it really is ushered in with the defeat of the Persians. The city of Athens was burned in the Persian Wars. And when the leader, Pericles, when the war was over and he fought in the war, he used one of the things I think is worth pointing out just really quickly is Sparta and the Spartans. They led the land army, and the Athenians, they were really in charge of building up the navy. And for those of you guys that know anything about military history, you know that navies throughout time have always trumped armies. Going all the way back to, or going to, what you might know about England and the English Navy. Anyway, the Athenian Navy became incredibly important. And to be clear, the Athenians were given money from all of these other Greek city-states. So during the war, all of these other Greek city-states, they agreed to give Athens money. And they came out here to one of these islands called Delos, and they built this massive fleet of ships and then conscripted people from all across Greece to use this navy. And what was happening is that the Persians, who were way off this direction over in Iran, they were marching an army up around here. I'm going to do this in red really quickly so you can see that. They were marching an army up and around here. And that army was the most massive army anyone had ever seen in the world. And they had actually managed to get all the way down into Athens and burn the city to the ground, as I mentioned before. While Athens was building this navy, the Spartans were gathering together an army. You're going to see why this history is incredibly important in a moment. The point being that many of you guys may know the old Napoleonic phrase that an army marches on its stomach, meaning that it only goes as well, things only go as well, and an army only goes as far as it has food and supplies. So that was what the Navy was doing. The Navy realized that this army was so massive, marching this far away from Persia and Iran, modern day Iran, which is so far off this way, they would actually need a massive fleet of ships in order to bring all of the supplies. So the Navy was really in charge of taking out these ships that sort of followed the army with them. And at the Battle of Salamis, the Athenians defeated this massive fleet through outmaneuvering them. And then, of course, later on, several other battles, Battle of Plataea being one of the last battles that the Athenians and the Spartans defeated on land, the Persians. The point is that brought great wealth and great opportunity to those people who were sort of in charge of the Delian League. Now, historians will tell you that what should have happened, or maybe what was supposed to happen, is when the war was over, all of the money that had gone into the Delian League was supposed to be returned back to the individual city-states. But what happened instead was that Pericles, who was in charge of the Delian League at that time, and was also an Athenian statesman, was elected archon, which is kind of like the equivalent of president of the United States in Athens, and he used the wealth and the money to rebuild the city, specifically to rebuild that place that you guys are quite familiar with, I think probably called the Acropolis, and buildings on the Acropolis like the Parthenon. And so what we have here on the Parthenon are these sort of demonstrations of buildings that sort of certify a way of life, and this idea that a much smaller nation that was more democratic and unified in these times of troubles could overcome, a powerful, tyrannical empire. Um, and I think that's why in America, and I think that our founding fathers in particular, looked to these Greek stories and looked to these Roman stories as sources of great influence on their own value systems. And that's really important because when we look at modern American architecture, when we look at modern American sculpture, when we look at modern American art, it has its maybe not modern, but 17th, 18th, 19th century um, American art and architecture and things like that. It has its inspiration, its roots in these places. And so we're going to see with the birth of ancient Greek art, architecture, sculpture, and things like that, we're going to see 2,000 years of influence. And so that's the thing that I'm trying to sell to you, is that that's what makes this so incredibly important, is that the sort of democratic standards that were set here are going to continue to be sort of influential for those who want to have democratic systems. And they're going to look to the style that we see in places like Athens, like in Athens and on the Parthenon, as being a style that represents the notion of democracy. Of course, it wasn't purely democratic. We know that women couldn't vote. That doesn't mean that women didn't have a role to play. We're going to talk extensively about the role that women played in Athenian society. But to sort of pitch it one more time, I want to make sure I'm being very clear here. We're not really going to be talking about all of ancient Greece. We're really going to be talking about the Athenians themselves, because they are sort of the bulk of what we have to look at. And that excites me anyway, because they are, the deep and influential people. All of the major philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they all started in Athens, right? All the great statesmen from the period, from Demosthenes to Pericles, these guys were all um, in Athens. And even, like some of the great mathematicians and things like that, like Pythagoras, traveled to Athens. And so there's a lot of names and there's a lot of things like the Parthenon and the Acropolis. And, there's a lot of these little details and things. It's going to get really, really wild. And there's going to be a lot of information. Um, Notions of humanism, which we stand by today, notions of rationalism and idealism. So to give you kind of like a hanger or something to hang this on, I'm gonna propose an idea. I'm gonna give you guys an idea that maybe will help you to sort of remember what it is that we're seeking. So um, what I like to start with is I like to tell people that if you want to remember Greece, you need to remember Pan. And Pan equals Greece. Now, this is where you're supposed to laugh, obviously, because, I'm referring to spray pan, that you spray in the pan and it creates grease, right? So you can like fry an egg or whatever if you use pan. I don't even know anybody who uses pan. But actually, it's funny, and so hopefully you'll remember Pan equals grease, because that's what I really want you to remember. And the reason why I want you to remember that is because I want you to sort of take an image, and I really want you to do this on paper. And sort of just do something like this. To me, this is it's a great way to sort of think about ancient Greece. Ancient Greece, um, especially Athens, they were, as we were saying here, rationalists and humanists. They spent an enormous amount of time thinking about ideals and philosophy and developing things like geometry, like Euclid, the geometer, and thinking about the nature of the world around them. They were, after all, oftentimes philosophers. But they weren't just philosophers. They spent enormous amounts of time rationalizing systems of philosophy. So they utilized mathematics as well. But they were also, looking around the world around them, and like many other people at the time, they were astronomers. But they were also, great thinkers at the time. People like Plato, right? And Plato, of course, developed what we know as the allegory of the cave, which was one of his great tracts about reality. Um, but he also believed that that man was the measure of all things, and there are two M's here. Man is the measure. And when people in Athens argued that man is the measure of all things, they quite literally believed that there were proportions in a man, in the perfect man, that when you examine the parts, you could actually engage in architecture. So to be clear, Greeks oftentimes, when they said something like man is the measure of all things, was the measure of all things, they quite literally meant all things. They quite literally meant that you could take the proportions of the ideal man, and you could, if you could conform those to a geometric relationship, then you could use those same measurements to build architecture. Therefore, when you look at something like the Parthenon on the Acropolis, what you're really looking at in many ways are measurements of man as the Athenians understood them. And so hopefully I've sold you on the idea that if you can remember Ham, you can remember a great deal about the significance and the importance of the Greeks. And what this also tells us is that when we study architecture, right, we're not just looking at a building. We're looking at something that actually represents a greater cohesive whole set of ideas about how the Greeks and specifically the Athenians saw the world. This tells us that when we look at a sculpture of a man, we're not just looking at a sculpture of a man, but rather we're seeing a complex set of philosophical notions about how a man should be measured and what they stand for. And so this reminds us of the importance that art in Greek society was more than just something pretty to look at, but rather were the foundations of how they thought about the world. And we see that from the very beginning, even when we go all the way back. And this is 770. This is what we call the geometric period. And it's not particularly important for our purposes, but it's sort of interesting for comparative sake. This right here is a massive vase, and the Greeks and the Athenians and the Corinthians in particular, who were next to the Athenians, would become really famous for making vases. And of course, vases, as we saw with the vases that we studied in Iran, with the ibex beaker, were important aspects associated with developed societies that used quite a lot of agriculture. And the Athenians grew olives, and they grew grapes, and they grew grains, and they exported those goods like wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean. And in fact, you could find decorated vases in other parts of the world, like the ancient Near East, like Egypt. I mean, it's no wonder that the Persians wanted to conquer Greece. It's because they understood that there was a great deal of wealth and learning and knowledge and all sorts of other wonderful things that were coming out of Greece. Hence, why they wanted them as part of their, to control them. But what we see here is actually not a vase for trade. It's not a vase for shipping goods or anything like that. The vase actually itself doesn't even have a bottom. It's hollow, or it's open rather. And if you look really closely, you can actually see that on this there's actually a funeral pyre. So they're actually engaged in a funeral, and you can see these wonderful sort of geometric forms, right, of people pulling their hair out. And then in this bottom register right here, you see some kind of military parade with like a chariot and horses. Wonderful early image from the 770s BCE, demonstrating this really interesting sort of geometric system of art in which the people almost look like this sort of geometric meanders that exist on this, right? There's not much of a difference between the sort of geometry of the vase and the geometry or the abstraction of the people. Really fascinating stuff. People become almost like patterns. But to give you a sense of what this really is, we got to see it in situ, in its context. And obviously, this is the original context because it would have been outside. This is actually a Diplon crater, which would have been found, would have been purchased, bought, and then utilized as a funerary monument. And so this would actually be in a cemetery. And cemeteries are actually going to play an interesting role, just like when we talked about the Egyptians, we're going to be talking about funerary practices with the Greeks as well. And one of the interesting things is that you can tell just by looking at this that the funerary practices of the Greeks were really quite different than the funerary practices of the Egyptians. One, we see people probably maybe being burned. It's hard to tell. But then we also see people suffering, people pulling their hair out, and really quite sad, as opposed to the sort of celebration that we might associate with Egypt and the planning that went in ahead. You see these people falling to their knees. There's some suggestion that they might have actually had professional mourners, like they do in some societies today. So we're going to shift now to sculpture. We're going to talk about early archaic sculpture. And again, archaic sculpture, for those of you guys who don't remember, is going to be somewhere around 600 BCE to about 500 BCE. And we're really only going to talk about Athenian sculpture for the most part. So the questions say here, why did the ancient Greeks focus so intensely on the human body in their art? And I already gave you some ideas when we talked about this concept of Pam, why man and the human body in particular is such an important concept. But there are other ideas too, that we should focus on. Why did Greeks, unlike other cultures, embrace the nude? Nudes are a significant part of Greek culture that you don't see in other cultures. Why is there such a rapid development of style? I would say change. When we were talking about the Egyptians, one of the things that we said is that there's a great deal of continuity. Here in Greece, we're going to see the opposite. We're going to see a great deal of change. And so it's worth asking that question, why is it that we see change in one? Why is it that we see continuity in the other? And then some basic things, the concept of a koros, the concept of a kore. In general, a koros is a man and a kore is a woman. And we'll get to some of these other questions later. So here we have some really interesting things. So this is obviously Menkaure and his wife Khmer-Nebti from ancient Egypt, 2500 BCE. Here we have a work of art from Greece from around 650 BCE. You see some similarities, but you also see a lot of differences. One of the things I always notice about this is, you have this arm sort of folded over. You have hair that's sort of over abstracted and geometric. You have weird sets of proportions. In fact, some people would argue that there might actually be more influence coming from the ancient Near East in sort of the plaited hair, and maybe the sort of like patterns or the sort of conical shape of the waist. But eventually you're going to get this sort of shift towards more naturalism. And if you remember the word naturalism, it's really a shift toward, I like to separate naturalism and realism, because realism to me means I'm going to paint something or I'm going to create it as it really looks. But naturalism means I'm going to sort of make it look like it could be real, right? And to me, that's a difference because, for example, if Menkaure is an old man, right, but I'm creating this image of him as Pharaoh, I'm going to make it look like a man still, like he would in nature, but I'm not going to make it realistic because I'm not going to put wrinkles on the guy. I'm going to naturalistically idealize him. So he's still going to look like a man, he's just going to look a lot younger, right? As opposed to realism, which is like, I'm going to make him ugly, I'm going to make him wrinkly, I'm going to make his ears, stick out, or whatever the case may be. So those are worth sort of differentiating between. Here we see a rapid shift and a rapid change from 650 to 530. That's about 100 years. A rapid shift towards more naturalistic figures. And this one also is painted. I think it's worth noting that this would have been painted. So what is white marble on the surface actually would have had decorative paint on this dress to make it look really sort of like, to make the dress look like it was real. The eyes would have been painted. The hair would have been painted. The lips probably would have been painted. So it would have looked even more naturalistic. This arm is missing, but we believe that this arm used to sort of stick outwards, and I can't draw that. And there would have been a hand, something like this, probably with a little offering of some kind in it. Some people suspect that it might have been offering something to a god. So that also sort of reminds us of a votive figure that we might see in the Sumerian societies, for example. But one of the most important things to know about this particular image here is that it was actually found on top of the Acropolis. And the Acropolis, once again, is in Athens. And it is the religious center. It is the religious center of Athens, which means that the sculpture that we're looking at, here, is a religious sculpture, which makes sense then that it might be engaged in some kind of offering. I just ran out of space there. There used to be a beautiful wood statue made of olive wood of Athena, and some people have hypothesized that this statue here may have actually stood in front of that statue of Athena and offered her something kind of like a votive offering. There's other people who have hypothesized that this may actually be Athena herself, and that her hand may be sticking out, and in her hand she might be holding a small representation of something we call winged victory, which is a little representation of a woman with wings, and we know her as Nike. Nike literally means victory, and there's this sort of concept we're going to look at of Athena the victorious, so to speak. So here we can see a close up of those, the remaining red paints. A lot of the other paints dissipate when something is outside, but red for some reason sticks. Hard to know why. Could be the particular pigments they were using. Interesting sort of thing to note about this as well is that there was a siege of the Acropolis in the 1900s by Turks, and the Greeks were fighting, and someone had turned the Parthenon, which was the big, giant, beautiful temple we're going to study later, into an ammo deposit of sorts, and so there was tons of ammunition and explosives and things like that, and somehow it got lit, and it exploded, and it blew out a wall of the Parthenon. And so a lot of statues like this, which stood the test of thousands of years, were in the 1800s, so only 200 years ago, blown to smithereens. And so, that's kind of worth thinking about. So here's something really fascinating to look at. This is Menkaure from 2500 BCE. This is a New Kingdom statue from 650 BCE. So here we've traveled nearly 2,000 years, and you still have that static foot forward, the arms clenched and at the side, the broad idealized chest, the frontal pose, something like a hood, a relatively naturalized but idealized face. The statue hasn't changed in nearly 2,000 years. By contrast, if we look at an archaic sculpture in Greece and move from 530 to something more modern, we start to see the use of different materials like bronze. This one might have also been an offering. Interestingly enough, just like we see in Sumerian and ancient Near Eastern societies, there's actually Greek lettering here. And it literally says that this is an offering to the far shooter Apollo. Of course, the far shooter is a reference to the fact that he shoots a bow. Probably would have had inset eyes. And this was probably an emblem or image of a warrior of some kind. We see this penchant for, testing boundaries in ancient Greece, an attempt to try and get ankles right, an attempt to sculpt an image that is completely freed from its stone. So we call this a free standing statue, where you've literally cut away all of the stone, something that the Greeks, something that the Egyptians never would have done, because for the Egyptians this was all about maintaining permanence. This was something that was literally supposed to last forever, so that the Ka of Menkaure could act as Horus and embody the statue, or literally go into the statue. Clearly, the Greeks aren't as interested in that, because these things broke all the time. In fact, you could finish carving one of these things and it wouldn't stand. You also see differences in terms of body type, and that is probably relates to the types of warfare that they engaged in. And so, as a result of the types of warfare they engaged in, what they thought was sort of beautiful in terms of the male body. So you'll note in particular very powerful hips, backside, and thighs that are really, really, really large. And in fact, they get larger over time. So these really sort of exaggerated, kind of looks like I guess you guys haven't been uh, alive long enough, but I, in the last 5 to 8 years, watched a dramatic change in the male ideal in the United States as squatting came into vogue, and people began to, both men and women began to like see the sort of broad, powerful thighs as a sort of concept of beauty. And for the Athenians, that was absolutely true as well. and that's probably because of hoplite warfare. Hoplite warfare meant that you stood in a line, you put your shield behind someone's back, and you did something very similar to a squat, where you sort of thrust forward with your spear out, and you acted like a wall that the other side would sort of run into. And so that type of warfare depended on having very powerful thighs. You held up a shield, and then your spear sort of rested here, and just sort of like you just thrust it outward. This would have been painted. Interestingly enough, we know that these statues of men here, you'll notice that there's a significant difference between statues of women. This one is obviously white marble, but it would have been painted. It was found on top of the Acropolis, and so it's associated with religious sculpture like offerings and things like that. These, on the other hand, were found in cemeteries. And this is what we call the cemetery in Athens. I should be very clear. The cemetery in Athens is called the Kerameikos, and it actually gets the name Kerameikos from the word ceramics, because it used to be that all the graves were made of pots, exactly like what we talked about when we looked at this piece back here. It was a ceramic, if you will, actually terracotta pot that was used to mark a grave. And it was used to mark a grave, and you could give offerings by putting offerings in here. And the nourishment was believed to sort of pass down through. It's why it was left hollow at the bottom and feed the soul. The Greeks had very dismal views of the afterlife, unlike the Egyptians. They believed that the soul wandered in the underworld for quite a long time, and that there was no real heaven like there was in Egypt. There was no place for you to reside afterwards. You couldn't ensure the happiness of the deceased, which might be why we saw images of people tearing out their hair. But that's particularly important if you want to talk about the development of Greek culture and Greek attitudes about this life. For the Egyptians, much of their life and much of their culture was centered around the afterlife. And their funerary ambitions, like the pyramids, clearly demonstrate that, right? That people would spend enormous amounts of time in their lives preparing their king, their god king, for the afterlife. Vice versa, in Athens, there wasn't really much of an afterlife. And this goes for all Greeks and Greek polytheists. There wasn't much of an afterlife. And so what you really had to live, your time, was really measured in the years that you had on this planet. And therefore, your accomplishments in this world were really all you had to sort of like look back on. These sorts of concepts are reinforced through the sort of mythological and semi-historical tales of people like Achilles, right? And people like Odysseus. These great heroes like Odysseus, who in the Odyssey did everything he could to get back to his wife, right? So that he could spend his years, his time, his life, what mattered, with her, versus Achilles, who lived a very short life, but the years that he did live earned him great glory, right? So this concept that what you do in your life matters because other people will remember you. And in some sense, to me, this is a really interesting sort of concept, an important concept for the Greeks, because glory was your afterlife. In some sense, for the Greeks, since when you died, you were just a shade in the underworld. The only way in which you lived eternally was through the stories that people told about you, and therefore your actions in this life mattered. And for a sculptor, right, a sculptor is doing two things here. A sculptor is, in this case, remembering a soldier who fought in a war and who died, right, and the glory that that soldier earned is supposed to be reflected in the statue itself. That's why we see this change. But we also see this change because if you're this sculptor who sculpts this image, and 100 years later, a sculptor's like, I want to be remembered more than this guy is remembered, right? Here's this famous sculptor. I want to outdo him so that I can attain true glory. I can't attain true glory by simply copying what he did. I must attain true glory by going further than that. And so Greek culture, as a result of all this, and this is what we call humanism, this drive, this absolute drive for human accomplishment, right? And um, if you think about the sculptor of this, he sculpts this great image that not only glorifies the soldier, but also glorifies himself as a sculptor. So it glorifies the soldier and the sculptor because people will forever remember the beauty and the naturalism and the idealism of the statue. Now, this again marked a grave. So the Koros, as we were talking about before, those terms earlier, the Koros was typically a statue that was associated with marking graves. It's a grave marker in the Archaic period. And that means if it was a grave marker, that it was found in the Kerameikos, which was the cemetery of Athens. A kore, on the other hand, which is this image here, is a female image, right? Women were not actually buried in the Kerameikos, not until much later in the late classical, and only if you had immense amounts of wealth as a female could your family members actually bury you there. And that's a whole other story. We'll talk about another time. But the kore women, there was you could say a fair amount of segregation within Athenian society. Men obviously were in the public realm. There wasn't a standing army. There was a hoplite army, which meant that like in times of need, regular everyday men were expected to sort of take up spear, shield, greaves, and all the sort of accoutrement of combat and things like that. Women, on the other hand, it's estimated that there was over 100. It's estimated that there were over 100 Athenian holidays, Athenian religious holidays, and women were really sort of like in charge of the spiritual life of the Greeks. So we see this rapid change, and we understand that what's driving this rapid change is this humanist culture. You could also imagine that if people believe that like what you do in this world matters, that really shapes their attitude towards their system of government, right? And their system of government, is essentially slowly develops into this thing where each individual, right, matters. And that's actually, and what they accomplish matters. That's actually what we call a meritocracy. One of the greatest speeches ever written on the concept of meritocracy, and I think there's very few people who don't believe in a meritocracy. A meritocracy essentially argues that what you earn in this world, whether it's in power and government or whether it's in monetary wealth, is through your merit, right? Through your hard work, your ethic, your beliefs, your morals, and these things like that. And the Athenians truly sought to be a meritocracy. Pericles, who once again was the great leader during the Persian Wars, and then became the archon or elected leader of the Athenians. When the Persian Wars were ending, or it might have been when the Peloponnesian Wars were starting, he gave this incredibly famous speech called the funeral oration. And in the funeral oration, still utilized today in every college that you go to, whether you're talking about politics or whether you're talking about history or whether you're talking about just about anything, you're gonna bump into Pericles' funeral oration, which is really sort of the ultimate speech that talks about creating a society that allows for meritocracy. He says things like, regardless of the state in which you are born, right? Meaning whether you're born poor or whether you're born wealthy, right? You can rise to a station based on your merit. And that is what truly sets Athens apart from other societies. And it's true, it's 100% true. And we see the concept of meritocracy right here. Once again, this notion that you should rise above, the constant sort of desire to rise above. This is why we see the change, or rapid change over time in art. And why we see something like the Critios boy, which ushers in the sort of early classical, sometimes called the severe period, right around 480. I think that's the year that I have down here for you guys. I just go back here and double check. It would be the best, yeah. So 480 right here. And again, 480 is like, the end of the Persian Wars. And so this represents sort of like, the beginning of what we will come to call the golden age of Athenian democracy. And the golden age of Athenian democracy, honest to God, it's actually a rather short period. of all these time periods in history, the golden age of Greek democracy is really only a 20-year period. But in that 20 years, and just so you know, we're talking like 470 something around there to about 450 something around there. And then the city will be burned to the ground by the Spartans again. So it's between what frames the golden age of Athenian democracy is the Persian wars ending, and then the Peloponnesian Wars ending, in which the Spartans defeat the Athenians for taking their money, as we talked about with the whole thing with the Delian League. But in that period, more knowledge, more ideas, more concepts that we're quite familiar with today exploded, absolutely exploded in this period. And so it's an incredibly important time period in history. So we see here these sort of like changes that, again, are a drive ever more towards naturalism. And we can see the drive towards naturalism in a lot of different ways. Number one, we can see the drive towards naturalism in the way in which they've depicted the hair. Someone has actually used a drill, literally like a metal drill, not the kind that is electronic, but the kind that you twist, sort of drill curls into the hair. And the way they made this top here was probably so that you could place a laurel crown, which for Apollo is laurel leaves. You would place this on a poet or a warrior or something like that sort of signified victory. So this image of the Critios boy was probably a boy who won some kind of victory in some kind of maybe athletic competition or something like that. They would have, the naturalism is heightened by the drilling out of the eyes, and probably with the inclusion originally of glass eyes. Look at the mouth. The mouth is actually really quite interesting because for hundreds of years, the Greeks had something we call the archaic smile, which is this idea that, like, we don't really know why, but they seem to put a smile on every single statue. Remember, this statue is a statue that represents the dead, and yet they put a smile on it. You see the same archaic smile here. You see the same archaic smile here. It looks like a goofy smile right there. You see the same archaic smile here. So it's a clear indicator of the archaic period. We're not sure why they did it. We think that they might have thought that it sort of heightened the naturalism. But we see here that this more sort of repose is what we call sort of like a calm, right? Art historians call this classical repose, which is sort of that calm, right? That would come to replace it. And interestingly enough, Greek sculptors would use it on everything. So if you want to sort of take a moment to look up the sculpture called the Discobolus is a guy who's about to throw a discus, and yet his face is perfectly calm. So again, they use it everywhere. But you also have the naturalism of the musculature. Notice the rib cage and the attempts at trying to understand the musculature that rests underneath, along with the bone structure that rests underneath, and trying to understand how certain muscles look, the belly button, versus this here, where they know there's a rib cage, and so they sort of like carved out this subtle parabola of some kind here. But it's not even close to what we have here. You'll also notice the sort of natural structure in the sternum and all of these other places, and perhaps the most dramatic change. You also notice the hands, right? The hands sitting down at the side in the archaic period with a single step forward. This is still Egyptian influence, right? Still an Egyptian influence. But here, we think that the hands definitely would not have been resting at the sides. And we know that the hands would not have been necessarily resting at the sides because we actually see a shift in the weight where one hip is slightly forward. You can see it here, and the other is slightly further back. You'll also notice that the knee bends, and his leg would have sort of gone back here. And it would not have been, you would have had to have elongate the leg significantly, which would have been unnatural. So we think that they probably would have had the foot sort of like resting up like this, and then this foot would have been next to it. So, and I'm not an artist, so you would have had this pose where he almost looks like he's about to move or is in the process of maybe moving, and his weight sort of shifts and turns. And you can see if you look at this hip here and this hip here, it's the same, but it's almost subtly different. You also look, there's a very subtle curve in the back, and you can just see here, it's a little bit easier to see here, a subtle shift. I'm going to exaggerate it. It kind of goes down. It doesn't, it does not exaggerate it like that, but then you see, because of the bent knee, you see another one here, and then because of the ankles, you see another one here, and it creates this sort of swinging. Sorry, I'm swinging the wrong way. Am I swinging the wrong way? This swinging. We'll see it more dramatically here. So here, it ends up becoming really clear, and then you have the evening of the hips, but then you'll notice that the eyes, right, the eyes sort of shift off this way, creating that very subtle curve from here to here, right? And then you get to the knees, and you have to start curving eventually to the other direction. So then it sort of slowly comes back. And so it creates this kind of very subtle S. We call this the S curve. And the S curve you'll actually see subtly in the spine, in the sternum. This S curve is associated with a natural stance that we call contrapposto. And contrapposto means counterpoise. I think I might have spelled that wrong. I think it's 2 E's and 1 P. I don't know. Anyway. But this is a really wonderful demonstration of all those things that I was talking about with Pam, because this is a mathematical formula in the form of a man. In fact, the sculptor who sculpted this, his name was Polykleitos, he developed something he called, Polykleitos developed something he called the canon of proportions. And a canon, for all intents and purposes, is a set of rules. So the way to understand the canon of proportions is to say it's the rule of proportions, right? Meaning that there's a set of rules, and that set of rules was actually mathematical, and it was based on a ratio. So the canon of proportions was based on a ratio. Now, history has sort of lost Polykleitos' exact ratio, but we know that the Greeks discovered other natural ratios. For example, if you look up the concept of phi, or the Fibonacci sequence, or what sometimes people call the golden ratio, for a long time people just assumed that this was the golden ratio, but we don't actually know. We don't know for a lot of different reasons. We know that Polykleitos wrote about it. We know that he wrote about, for example, the hand to the wrist being in a proportional measure from the hand to the arm. And so this ratio of this piece to this piece, right, it looks like it could be pretty close to like a 1-to-3 ratio, but it's probably not. It's probably more like a 1 to 3.8 or something like that, right? But then that ratio becomes sort of extended, right? And you can take that very same ratio and you can incorporate it here, right? And you can incorporate it in all the other parts. And so all of the parts are not actually, he's not actually using a model from nature, but rather as his inspiration, he's using a mathematical ratio, which he believes he finds in nature, and then sort of like corresponds everything to that. This would point out that from the chin, at least here to the top of the head, this would be a 1-to-7 ratio. So yeah, it's entirely possible. So again, though, here's why we don't know. The reason we don't know is what we're looking at here is actually a Roman copy. The Romans fell in love with the statue, and they copied it like crazy. Later Roman emperors, this statue was found in like every major Roman bath throughout Rome, and there were Roman baths all across Rome. And a Roman bath, by the way, was a place that you exercised, worked out, went into the hot pools, the cold pools, and had like it was like a place to sort of like take care of yourself, and typically it was men only and things like that. And they would go out, and there were fields typically around there to exercise and do things, and then go into the baths. And sculptures like this were oftentimes found inside. And so we know that even for the Romans, this represented an idealized version of sort of the athletic male, right? And we think that that's exactly what the Greeks believed as well. But again, we have lots of people writing about the sculpture. We have tons of copies of it, but the original sculpture was actually made of bronze. And bronze, our topic of bronze, is probably something we're going to have to do in another lecture here. But the bronze was melted down. And so therefore, we can't actually measure the original, and we don't actually have those things to sort of to make those decisions. So that's going to end our lecture for now. I hope that you guys can see everything that we talked about with Pam, and I'll just sort of point out as I sort of head out here, just point out a couple things. The sculptor here, his name is Polykleitos, right? And Polykleitos created this canon of proportions, right? Which he believed would create the ideal man, right? And he would use mathematical ratios to do that. Ratios, I should say. And interestingly enough, once again, this goes back to something we said before, the same ratios that he's actually using here would be ratios that they would use in buildings, in architecture. So, for example, the number of columns that were used on one side of a building would be a ratio to the number of columns used on the other side. So, like, you could use, like, for example, 4 to 12, which would be, what is that, a 1 to 3, or something like that. And so there was a sort of clear connection between things. Everything was linked, and mathematics oftentimes was an underlying sort of system through which you could link things. And beauty was linked to mathematics, and proportions, and ideals, and philosophy, and spending time thinking. And by the way, this goes back to perhaps one of the greatest concepts, which I said earlier, which is the allegory of the cave. And actually, if you go and you're interested in the allegory of the cave, you should go and spend a little time checking out something called the divided line. Right after Plato wrote the allegory of the cave in chapter 7 of the Plato's Republic, in chapter 8, he goes on to explain something called the divided line, which is an entirely different way of looking at the allegory of the cave. The divided line is essentially a series of ratios that explain all of human knowledge and the value that it has. And in that series of ratios, in which he sort of puts out all of these different forms of knowledge and which one's more valuable than the other, he has mathematics as being the one that gets you closest to the gods and things like that, and understanding the world around you. And so once again, math, right, and these notions of philosophy are so closely linked to these ideas of man's pursuit of perfection and ideas about that we see here in sculpture and architecture and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed this sort of long but deep dive